ComBank Summit, Forward Together 2025, creating a sustainable future.
Thank you very much. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, again. We have three panelists. You heard that they are representing three different types of knowledge. Mayuri is, of course, from the academia, so she's mostly talking about the scientific aspect. And Paru has been a policy expert for a long time, so she will mostly be dealing with policy. And, of course, Shirani has been a leading person in bridging biodiversity with the private sector. So I think that is the expertise she's going to bring here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to open up, I have a couple of rounds of questions for the panelists, and then I'm going to open it up for you because I'm sure all of you have a lot of things that you would like to ask these panelists. So without further ado, the first question I'm going to pose is to Mayuri, because as I've indicated, the challenges ahead are very, very strong. We have to have very strong evidence base if we are to achieve a planned approach to reverse the current biodiversity crisis. So my question is, how important is scientific research in achieving these post-2020 biodiversity framework goals?
Yes, I think as an academic, we are engaged in a lot of research, and in terms of conservation, I think a lot of conservation actions would be more effective if it's rooted in scientific knowledge, if scientific knowledge guides the conservation actions that we often engage in. So let me just, without making you bored, just run through just a couple of examples. For example, one of the targets is to rescue biodiversity, and we know that, as Professor Devaka mentioned, a lot of our species are now facing severe threats of extinction. So, given that their habitats probably are already threatened, one of the ways in which you can salvage these species is through a hybrid with ex situ and in situ conservation. Now, it's easier said than done because ex situ conservation is a very difficult thing to do. And scientific knowledge is absolutely essential, starting from bringing in species to captivity, to maintaining them. You must know what to feed them, the right proportions of males and females, what are the critical habitat elements that they would require to make the environment, the artificial environment congenial to them, and also if you achieve captive breeding, even when releasing them to the field, there are so much of, a lot of captive breeding programs have failed. You invest heavily, but they fail because they're not based on proper scientific know-how. Then also, he was talking of habitat restoration, right? So habitat restoration often involves removal of invasives. Removing is easy, but what do we replace them with? And this is something that we often encounter in several programs, because we have to get expert knowledge on selecting the particular plant species. You can't. A lot of replantation programs are often not really well guided, and they end up becoming more of a problem than a benefit. So selecting the right species for the particular soil, for the elevation, for the climatic zone needs a lot of expert knowledge. Managing problem animals, as you all know, we had a human-monkey conflict, the human-elephant conflict, all of that, and here I'm not saying that we don't have the knowledge, that this knowledge needs to be generated. We do have a lot of knowledge already at hand, but probably there's some gap in using that knowledge in designing a lot of conservation, in taking conservation initiatives. So that is probably one gap to be filled, where we use the existing knowledge. Generating new knowledge is important, but using existing knowledge in order to shape our conservation actions.
Thank you, Mari. And also, I think when we talk about conservation, it's a very complex sector. There are agencies that are doing conservation, then there are agencies whose work against conservation. So, and also to achieve anything, I think there are three pathways. One is encouragement, one is punishment, thirdly, attitudinal change. We know the ideal is attitudinal change, but we do need laws because it's an essential part. And we also need policies which tells us what actions we should take, how do we manage invasive species, how do we manage our biodiversity, and so on. So policies and laws play a very important role in anything, especially in biodiversity conservation. So my next question is for Taruka. Is our current policy legal framework sufficient to achieve this, because we have so many policies which directly and indirectly affect biodiversity, or do we need any further changes or updating in order to effectively conserve Sri Lanka's biodiversity?
Thank you, David. In terms of, building on what you presented, I think both the international and domestic policy environment, there's a lot of input in terms of policy. There's sufficient policy existing, I think. But where it fails is we don't have that pathway from policy to practice. Even in the international, as you presented the new targets for 2030 for biodiversity as well as sustainable development. These are all high-level policy objectives. Some of these get translated locally. Some of them even very specific policies. I don't know how many of you know. We have a policy for invasive species. We have a policy for human-elephant conflict resolution. But how much of this gets translated to practice? And what is that pathway? I think that is a big question. So there is a level of governance, the government and other high-level stakeholders who make policy. Very often us UN agencies are accused of proliferating policy, making too much of it, making it too complex. But then it is up to, again, the national stakeholders to make it work. So then there is this gap. How do you translate it into practice? So when translating it into practice, I think three big challenges. One is, obviously the coherence between other development policies and environmental and biodiversity policies. So I'll just give a quick example, such as the human-elephant conflict or the human-wildlife conflict vis-a-vis our agriculture expansion and irrigation expansion policies, right? So one is considered like the biggest, says every political party will promise this, every government will invest. We've borrowed billions from development banks, multilateral banks, from bilateral sources to expand our irrigation, make full self-sufficiency, expand export agriculture. And this has come at a cost. So that comes, really the human-elephant conflict began in terms of how we have expanded our irrigation infrastructure primarily. Then that comes to the question of valuing biodiversity. So in being able to make policy into practice, you need a value. Biodiversity right now has no value. A friend I met during coffee time, he was complaining that, there is so much pressure to release forests again for agriculture expansion, right? That is because there is still that demand for land, even though most farmers are cultivating and living in poverty. There is still that agrarian sort of sentimental demand that comes from the grassroots for more land and more investment in perhaps a failed way of rural development. So the third point is kind of having the incentives and tools. So maybe disincentives as well. Sometimes we give agriculture subsidies, we give fertilizer subsidies, which work very much in contrary to conserving biodiversity. And this is not like the big species we see to our, who are visible, but soil biota, which you were discussing about. So we lose ecosystem health without actually seeing it being lost, until one day we realize, it cannot be replaced in a hurry, and restoration is very expensive. So I will leave it there. We can come back to any questions.
Then I think I'm going to move to a slightly different area, because in this country, traditionally conservation has been bestowed upon the state. Wildlife Department and Forest Department were the leading agencies who engaged in conservation. The academia, of course, did the research, but the private sector did not play a huge role in it. And I think today we are here because the commercial bank has identified the importance of sustainability. But I think Shirani has done some pioneering work in trying to bring the private sector into the conservation theater. It has not been easy, I think, and also the issue is conservation is not their forte. They are business people. And so whether they are investing in the right kind of conservation project, these were the issues that we had to deal with. So what I would like to ask from you is the private sector doing enough, or can they do better? Are there any barriers for them to effectively engage in conservation?
Thank you, Devaka. And first of all, I like to thank this commercial bank for giving us this opportunity. And also, I have to say that they are an esteemed patron member of Biodiversity Sri Lanka, and one of the first members who had the courage to step into a field that was quite new. So congratulations to Commercial Bank, and I'm proud to be here today. Now, I'd like to begin answer to your question, Devaka, by talking about my previous experience when I was a novice at the Central Environmental Authority. Now, at that time, we battled because private sector was totally against environmental, conservation, and it was always seen as the other side of the coin. So, even when the environmental impact assessment regulations were brought in, it was a huge battle. But over the years, and now when I sit here, I can say that there has been a complete transformational shift, because private sector is taking a leading role in environmental conservation in the country. And this summit alone is a very good example of a private bank taking the lead in bringing together. Their tagline says, "Forward Together," which is what we are all trying to do. So basically, I think, from my point of view, the tide has turned. When you say, is there more that they can do? Yes. But certainly they have taken the correct steps to go in the right direction. And I must also say that, as Mayuri said, science-based conservation is what we are trying to do. And it is not just planting a sapling on the brink of a river, which private sector used to do, called World Forestry Day or something, or replanting day, or there was planting weeks and things like that. And even post-tsunami, the mangrove restoration that we did. They all perished. But today, they are all backed with science. And every single initiative, I can proudly say, that the private sector is doing is backed by a science-based conservation agency. Either it can be an IUCN, or it can be a university, it can be even a CSO, which is looking at the correct way of doing things. And we are seeing remarkable results. Now, you know very well, and Commercial Bank also is a partner of a restoration project that we are doing in Kannelia Conservation Forest. Today, after 6 years, we are seeing a Mayuri spoke about invasives. But someone says Catula is not an invasive, I don't know, right? But it has infested this whole conservation forest. And we have managed with the partnership, public-private partnership, forest department and the private sector, and not only just the private sector, a consortium of private sector, some of which are in, say, banks and banks. They don't really even look at whether there is competing agencies, which is also absolutely important. Where we have restored, and as Devaka and all say, this forest is now ready in certain parts, and succession has already commenced. And he has taught the private sector what succession means, and how you look at a canopy, and how you understand it. So, this sort of thing really gives a huge, courage to us to be able to, do this. But you also asked me, are there barriers? Today we have two agencies, which are the main conservation agencies in the country. I think 70% of the land areas we have is under the Department of Wildlife Conservation and the Forest Department. Now, every forum we go to, from biofilm to the implementation of the Sri Lanka's National Adaptation Plan, every time we are told that there is a financial gap to implement what we want to do or to fall in line with these policies and plans that we have. So knowing full well that we don't have enough money to do this, why then are so many barriers put in when the private sector wants to step in and do something that is good for the nation? So I think first that mindset change has to happen in the state agencies. I mean, we see it has improved, but again it depends on the boss or who is there at the head, So, I mean, there's such a conflict in this whole thing that it's difficult, and that's why I think agencies come to Biodiversity Sri Lanka and such agencies, so that we grapple with those agencies and they don't grapple with them, and we become like a broker, in this whole thing. So, I mean, if we can't manage to convince these state agencies that the much wanted funds is coming from the private sector, and it's huge. We have only 85 members. We have done some kind of a study as to what is the investment, and it's huge there, and they don't even know, and they don't even call them for multi-partner dialogues. When there are, forums that, what they do is they will invite the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce, expecting the 3,000 members to be represented by the chamber, So you have to have them engaged in dialogue. So my problem is that there isn't that connection between the state and the private sector.
I think that is one of the biggest challenges we'll have to overcome. Because they can play a huge role. And connected to that, I think slightly, because we're talking about restoration and how the private sector is willing to invest in it. Now, I talked briefly about our protected area network, because that's going to be the first line of defense in trying to save species, because protected areas play a huge role in biodiversity conservation. And as I've indicated, the target is to have 30% of a state protected by 2030. And I've also indicated that we've already achieved that goal. We have 30% under protection under Forest Department and the Wildlife Department. But the question that I raise, is quantity enough, or is there quality? Do we have 30%? Because every ecosystem has an ideal state. And what we are protecting, are they at the ideal state? Or if not, what do you have to do? That's why we have to manage ecosystem. So the question that goes to Mayuri is, in your view, is it sufficient to protect our critical biodiversity? And are we managing it enough to maintain them at the optimum level that we would like them to be?
Yes, Professor Devaka, as you said, we'll probably only have a protected area network to rely on fully in the future. So, as you said, we do have a large extent of land under protection. for a small island like Sri Lanka, but is it enough? So talking of biodiversity, I mean, our primary objective in declaring them as protected areas is to protect our biodiversity, which means the biodiversity as well as the endemism. Now, I think we all know that over 70% of our biodiversity, whether it's plants or animals, and an equivalent proportion of our endemics is restricted to the wet zone of the country. And the wet zone is practically about 1/5 of the country, and we have about 50% of our population living in the wet zone. So it is not adequate at all. I mean, we do have 30%, we have already achieved it, but we don't adequately have protected areas where they're most needed. Heavily fragmented and small isolated patches of forest in the wet zone are totally inadequate to protect our biodiversity and our endemic species. So this is something that we've known, and that's something that we cannot rectify, given that about 50% of our population is living in the wet zone. But of course, we have to do something, and there are ways and means of improving the effectiveness of our protected area network. For example, I think you had also mentioned in your presentation about connectivity. So connectivity, connecting two small fragments, will make that entire patch more effective, even for larger species, like perhaps even the leopard. Right, so there is a small patch, the population size for any species, there's a minimum viable population size, and there's a minimum land area that is required for that species to survive in the long run. So if you connect to forest patches through plantations, and I think the UNDP is supporting an innovative project where we are looking at plantations. About 60,000, I think, of our plantations, rubber and tea, have about 60,000 hectares of natural forest patches or natural habitat. So why not make use of these forest patches to link forests, link isolated protected areas. It can also be done by enriching home gardens, and I think even the IUCN has taken an initiative now to identify areas outside our protected area network, which are vital, maybe as stepping stones in between two protected areas, or just by being near a protected area so that you can link it in some way and then make the protected area network more effective. So we always knew it, and I think we can't rectify that damage, that we have lost much of our forests, but still for all there are many other state forests that are still remaining in the wet zone and in many of the other regions of the country, which don't really get enough protection as our normal protected areas. So we should take the initiative as a country to salvage every little natural habitat to the extent possible, of course, and also to link through other innovative means, even by enriching home gardens. So I think you also asked about protected area management, or yeah. So I think I'll be a little diplomatic here. So if you go to the protected areas, one of the biggest hindrances is funds. So given the lack of funds, I think the protected areas are unable to focus on the more important issues at hand. They lack staff for patrolling. They lack funds for maintenance. Protected areas are not only important for biodiversity and ecosystem services, but they also bring in a lot of revenue to the country. So you have to maintain that potential. Having said that, there are a lot of drawbacks that I see, limitations that I see in prioritizing the tasks or the actions, management actions in these protected areas. And we were earlier saying, yes, our protected area network is large, but are they serving the purpose? Are they in a good condition? Now, this is something that I'm afraid even the government does not prioritize, because many of the protected areas, particularly those in the dry zone, have, it's natural for a wetland or for a grassland because they are ephemeral or they're temporary ecosystems. They progress through ecological succession, and that can be detrimental to safeguarding the very species you set out to conserve. For example, a wetland must have hands-on management, dredging, removal of invasives embedded in their management plan. Right now, these are done when projects come on board, and as I think Biodiversity Sri Lanka and other organizations like that help with it. But one of the problems I see is some of those are not sustainable. When you have a project to remove invasive species, yes, for about 3 or 4 years, it happens. But then after that, once that project ends, and this is something that we've heard a lot of authorities saying, ඒ කාලේ මේ ආයතනයෙන් අපිට සල්ලි හම්බුණා, right? But now we don't have funds to do it. But this is critical. These are critical elements. Prescribed burning, removal of invasives in grasslands, absolutely essential to maintain the diversity of ungulates, including the elephants. So yes, there is a huge financial constraint and logistics, also staff allocations are very, very poor. But at the same time, there are things that the management can do to improve the status and the health status of those protected areas with the resources that they have if they are given a free hand. So I hope I answered your question.
Yes, I am going back to Taruka. You touched upon this earlier about conflicting interests, because I think one of the biggest problems we are facing in biodiversity conservation in this country is mega development projects. Somebody said in the initial, at the opening, that we are trying to increase our forest cover by 2%. 2% is 120,000 hectares. 1% is 60,000 hectares. That's a huge undertaking. But the reality is we are losing 7,000 hectares annually due to mega development projects. So rather than increasing, we are on a trajectory of losing. So this is the mismatch I see. And that's a question I'm going to pose to Taruka. Is our development sector take biodiversity concerns into their policy making, or what do we have to do to get the development sector more responsible, more sustainable? Maybe it's a difficult question, but I think that's something that we have to find answers for.
Yeah, thank you, Devakan. So the development, obviously, that's one of the greatest threats, not just in Sri Lanka, I think anywhere, and especially in rapidly developing countries and countries with the ambition of bridging this middle income or getting over this middle income trap, traveling to high income. So development projects demand land, demand water, demand certain areas that we would like to conserve. So there's always this talk of this issue of balancing. What do we need to conserve? What is so unique to Sri Lanka that we wouldn't want to touch it even if it gives us economic return? So I come back to my initial point. It's very hard to do that if you don't have a value for it. A wetland, those days, remember when Muthurajawala policy making was happening, it has ended up in a disaster. It should have been conserved, about 60% of it at least, but it was degazetted later. to allow for development, for energy, for the expressway to go through, for garbage dumping, of all things, right? So this conundrum exists, and there is no easy answer, but we do have the tools. We have the EIA, Shirani, we have tools to regulate that. But again, how sincerely are these applied? Even when an EIA is done, when an environmental impact assessment is done and is approved under conditions that certain areas which are deforested, which are destroyed, are then replaced, or there is some kind of restoration to replace that lost ecosystem, nobody monitors that it is actually done like that, right? So these gaps exist, and these gaps really undermine biodiversity loss. And again, because of the lack of actual value, it's hard to ascribe monetary value to every species, every microbe in the soil, or even an elephant. But we have to have some idea of what we are losing. Because it's very easy to justify the development return. Any politician, any private sector, anybody will be very happy. They'll be forthcoming with the data on the development impact. But we don't really know what we are losing. So that is a gap, I think, even in science, even in trying to translate what is there in biodiversity into some kind of value, ascribing some kind of value to it. So tools exist. The capacity to carry out and monitoring is an issue. So development will continue to be a threat, I think. But I hope that it's nice to see a lot of young people in the audience who I hope are growing up with being more aware of these challenges and being more aware of the values, actually, than maybe when we first entered this field. Thank you.
So we were talking about development and also conflicting interests. Another issue that affects conservation is poverty. Because if you look at all of our protected areas, the communities that surrounds the protected areas are marginal social groups, which has to depend on natural resources, which has a negative impact. So my question is, how do we address this? What can we do to address poverty by converting them from exploiters to protectors? Is there a pathway?
I like to take an example here, Devaka. Now, in the Chilau area, in the Anavilundava wetland, there was at one point about 30 years ago, shrimp farming was quite a big money spinner. It was an economical, great way to make quick money. So communities were benefiting from that industry. So when the wildlife department, and the whole industry died because of unsustainable use, and all this polluted water went in, and all the prawns got white spot disease, and the whole thing was wiped out. So unsustainable development is just that. So then the Department of Wildlife Conservation took all that area in, and it was all mangrove area before this happened. And I don't know, I learned later that mangroves grow only where mangroves have been before. So therefore, the Wildlife Department sought private sector support to reforest that area. And the communities protested loudly because they didn't want that area reforested, because they had a lucrative economic, they wanted it given back to the industry. And so communities also were very much against this, and there was a lot of protests at that time when the gazetting was going on. But today, when the reforestation has started, they are being invited to find the seeds come and, grow it and reap the benefits, because they understand that now that the mangroves are coming back, the fishers are finding it easier to get their, little fledglings, and, the whole industry is coming back. So communities will go where the funds are, the money is. So we have to make sure that we show them the path. And today, private sector gets engaged in conservation, not for conservation. Those days are gone, where conservation is done for conservation. They also want something in return. I mean, not that they ask for it, but we like to see that they are incentivized in some way. Now, in this particular plot, we started looking at bio-credits, carbon credits, because mangroves are very lucrative, earners of carbon credits. But the government of Sri Lanka, you heard in the morning, that they are trying to become net zero by 2050 or something. So all protected areas we cannot trade or we cannot offset or do anything in those areas, because they are using that for offsetting Sri Lanka's carbon. So we were trying to get these credits and find a formula that the government gets back something, say 70% because it's state land, and 30% at least to be given to the investor and the communities as a way, because they are helping ecosystem services. So, I mean, these are ways in which you can incentivize both the private sector and the communities that depend upon these on these natural resources. And this has been happening for generations. As you say, the natural resources have been where people lived upon, and beekeeping and all these things were going on, and they even used to go to forest and collect various things, I mean, non-timber based products and, things like that. So, it's very difficult to actually work in a financial environment where we would like to. And, I mean, it also goes to show, I just like to bring a small example in. We have this Kannediya plot, and we were trying to get bio-credits for the companies that actually invested in this. Because we thought, I mean, this is a forest belonging to the forest department. And here some private sector companies come in and invest all their money and, to a job that the forest department should be doing. So we thought, that they should be incentivized in some way by giving them some bio-credits. Then the government said, no trading, no offsetting. Right? But if you want, you can calculate them. So now we are at the stage where scientists, leading scientists of Sri Lanka, have found a method to, some criteria to look at bio points. Now we are not calling them credits, because we can't. Because you can't offset. No, when you say credit, it means offsetting or it means trading. So they won't hear of it. So basically what we are doing is we are calling them bio points, and we are going to make a register saying Dilma has earned 50 points by doing this, by applying a certain set of criteria which has been worked out by scientists and accepted also by the forest department. Now we have come to a stage where they have accepted the science and they have said, fine, you can calculate that. So, in Sri Lanka, you have to go step by step. You can't jump and say, I want to go and get credits and all that. So we start with points, hoping that we can move to the next level. So, if you want to look at incentivizing communities, getting them involved, the financial, alternative financial mechanisms or innovative financial mechanisms should be pilot tested and shown. So that, and I'm happy that the JEF7 project is doing just that, So we need to show some examples, because even the plantation sector, which you very well know, is doing a lot of reforestation, doing again mixed cropping, so much, and doing that because they love the land. So, we have to have a small shift in the way, not that old conventional way that our departments think. They should be looking at it in a different way, because otherwise, the whole thing will fall.
I think you touched upon a very important thing. We need a paradigm shift, because I think I talked about a lot of innovative financing like payment for ecosystem. We piloted a lot of these. We found that there are very serious policy gaps, which doesn't allow us to take it to the next level. But with that, I think you have been waiting patiently, sitting and listening to us. I would like to open up the floor for any questions or clarifications for the panel.
First of all, many kudos to Commercial Bank calling this particular dialogue, which is very timely and also very potential, calling all these industry experts and also key stakeholders to come on board, and then to take forward this dialogue, the formidable mandate ahead. I'm actually thinking in the perspective of finance space, how this sustainable equation would pave way for development as well. We are a developing country, so we may need to kind of accept certain damages taking place and looking at some convergence where we can kind of have a trade-off where each industry might contribute positively as well as negatively. So looking at the footprint as well as the handprint. So my question, while it stems around this particular dialogue, revolving around this dialogue, what I'm saying is whether we can have a mapping done for each industry, looking at their produce or the service that they provide, their engagement with the biodiversity sphere of it. There can be some, it's not actually a kind of dictative, but a directive, a volunteerism to play, and then create some stage to kind of have the positive impact, where we look at the impact that industry make and setting up some thresholds. Okay, look here, now this is the impact that you are making individually and also collective, looking at some dimensions geographically and various other ways and means, looking at science-based evidences and also some researchers going along with the evidence-based. So are we in such a thinking and giving out some suggestions or some catalysts to play this particular role, how we can look at this mighty convergence? So how we can step forward? It's actually a voluntarism to play, though. Still, I think a science-based approach where we will invite the industry experts as well as some key stakeholders to gather around that dialogue, how this particular thing is going into the policy level interventions and the procedures, not just merely confined to words and statements on papers, but as Professor Devaka very well explained, how we can put it to the real ground experience. So looking at the common benefit, are we having a skeleton in the national dialogue, whether we have some critical mass which has to play the role, and then looking at all that, irrespective of the externalities or geopolitical barriers. So are we in such a kind of a mapping out, and then we invite everyone to come on board? This is mighty because this addresses the common dialogue, because this particular biodiversity sphere is very much essential as a factor of production. So the interaction and also the integration, how it is melded into their business case, as it is quite positively addressed. We also, as financiers and also the business people, we will be looking at and we will be exploring the business case of biodiversity. So I think if you can advocate, because this particular dialogue is really vital, and then also this is a mighty opportunity that Commercial Bank has paved the way forward. And then to have a spark, looking at some low-hanging fruits where we can begin with some baby steps towards that particular kind of passionate and more determined objective to reach. Thank you.
Yeah, so just to give you a few pointers, As Taruka mentioned, the Kunmin Montreal Biodiversity Framework that Sri Lanka is also signatory to. There is one target that specifies that the government makes mandatory biodiversity disclosure. So at the moment, as you say, it's completely voluntary. And there are some companies that are biodiversity dependent that are actually disclosing their biodiversity footprint, like you say. So basically, they are looking at maybe GRI reporting, which is not the best, but they also look at science-based targets, and there are other disclosure guidelines and standards that some of the companies are working on. So there are some companies that are already looking at the material, what really affects them, and looking at disclosing their impact on biodiversity and then taking steps to correct that. So now in this discourse, I think there was some suggestions that these things are expensive. Everyone can't do it because biodiversity is a very complex subject, and you need specialists to say whether even I'm scared to do anything without asking the Devaka and Mayuri and people like that whether it's scientifically correct. So companies need that kind of support. So it's not an easy thing to do, and it's a cumbersome thing, I must say, because it is a complex scientific subject. So some companies like Dilma, they have their own biodiversity experts and people like that, but everyone doesn't have that, to do this. So it is a difficult thing because they have to have separate budgets, for this. But if the government, at the moment it's voluntary, and the government is looking at having a national standard if possible, because Sri Lanka is very unique, and what applies in the West may not be applicable to our country. So they are looking at, in the interim, why? Because when they are exposed to the EU and all, you need to fall in line with those international standards. So we have to also get our standard, whatever we specify for Sri Lanka, to be acceptable to those external markets. So I think steps are being taken, and we are going to make biodiversity disclosure mandatory in the country. So that's that is it. I think some of you may have been in the discussions that the ministry had in this regard.
Thank you so much for this opportunity, Commercial Bank. And I'm Sandun Pereira, representing the academia, that's Sabaragamu University, as well as the Sri Lanka program of IUCN. So thank you so much for this previous question, because that paves the way for my, actually this is not a question, this kind of a, thought to provoke a discussion from here, because President Devaka very correctly said that we have kind of made the 30% target, or the target 3 of the global biodiversity framework. At the same time, Professor Mayuri pointed out, but we have not conserved our critical species, that is the endemics and the threatened species, most of which are lying outside the protected area network, that is already 30%. So, which means we need to protect these critical species outside our protected area network, for which, again, the global biodiversity framework has provided a new avenue, which they now call it PCAs, not the PAs, not only the protected areas, but also protected and conserved areas. So by CAs, or conserved areas, they also provide a long name called OECMs, or other effective area-based conservation measures. The point I want to raise here is that this is a forum with private sector and the financing bodies. So this is a really great opportunity where the private sector can have their own privately protected conserved areas. And also, Ms. Dasaratna's biodiversity points can be made biodiversity credits in those areas, because they will not be counted for the national commitment for the net zero. So this is, I think, something that can be brought up for discussion and for thought for the private sector, where they can have their own conserved areas, and that can be made into financial, not only the good-hearted conservation, but also that can be made into financial benefits. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandun. Actually, I also wanted to speak about OECM, so you just covered it, so I won't touch upon there. But what I wanted to highlight was that there is a bit of a number confusion that is going on, because when we initially embarked on 3% of a forest cover increase, we considered at that point our forest cover as 29.6, so that we will go up to 32.6 was the initial plan. With the latest NDC revision, I don't know if it has changed. If it hasn't changed, it has to be 32%, 32.6. So that we might have to clarify so that everybody knows what we are working on. And additionally, we also embarked on the bond challenge. I think we need to restore about 200,000 hectares of forest cover. And a lot of people believe, I think there was a mention here on the panel also somewhere that that we are losing about 6,000 hectares of forest cover. So whether we are able to achieve this by 2030, but I think in my opinion, it's quite possible, 200,000 hectares. We also do certain projects which are roughly about 100 hectares worth of projects under our organization. I'm pretty sure there are other organizations that are doing even bigger sort of restorations, including probably corporate players. So that is another area that we might have to highlight where there is so much of opportunities for corporate sector. For instance, there is 9,000 hectares of lands under Department of Forest Conservation, while understanding what Shirani mentioned that there is a little bit of red tape in getting these projects going. But otherwise, in one place in Kabalitta Wattegama itself, 9,000 hectares of lands available for restoration. But there are logistical and other difficulties in that area. And then also about the one other thing that we need does not come on most of the places, but we have to highlight is that we also need to have a 30% of a marine protected area under Kunming-Montreal Protocol. So right now we only have 1% of a, less than 1% of a marine protected area. So what are we doing or going to do about our CBD, biodiversity target in terms of marine area conservation? What can the government, institutions, bureaucrats, corporations, policy advocates, activists can play in terms of getting this somehow materialized, not at 30%, but at least something reasonable, because we are not even at 1%, except for one election manifesto this time. There was a mention about this, which I was happy, but then I don't know if they really understood the seriousness of making a statement of making 30% of a marine protected area by 2030. But yeah, these are some of the things that I wanted to highlight, which I believe that we can also focus and start discussing. Thank you.
I think I'll respond to 30% marine, that's a target. But the issue is we don't have the resources to police it. And also we have a marine area that is 8 times the size of the land. So I think declaring will not be an issue because I mean a lot of that marine area we are not using, so we can, for name's sake, we can declare it. But the question is whether we declare it for a specific purpose. We don't know enough about our marine environment to really address that issue. So I think that is the obstacle we are facing.
But Devaka, yeah, you know, this private sector has a role there, because if the wildlife department can indicate where there is good biodiversity in the marine realm, they can, you know, do basic research, because you need to have data to, and Kayankani was done by a research project done by Tokyo Cement and Dilma. So, you know, so there is a room if the state agencies also tell us where are the areas that you get high biodiversity. And also there are conflicts, there are fishery zones and all kinds of things in between.
So if I may just add a point, Yeah, as he said, declaring protected areas is one thing, but I think managing marine protected areas are far more difficult than managing terrestrial protected areas because the threats themselves are far more diffused. You can't really manage it. So I think that is also something that we have to keep in mind while we invest in protecting it, whether we can actually maintain the quality of that protected area. Yeah, thank you.